Grate some Parmesan next to mine. Okay. Simple guy. Whatever. I guess this one. Careful.
Very nice.
Larry says, very nice work.
Yeah.
Only thing missing is wine. I didn't have white wine. So
Oh yeah, that's a
we're in the middle of nowhere and I can't. Normally I use verjuice. It's just raw grape juice.
yeah.
Like the Islamic way to deglaze pan.
Cool.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
All the same.
Screw it. Wait a second.
That's okay here.
Okay, well then we'll do it live, as they say. Hello. We're still in chapter 6. Welcome to Weekly Marx. Chapter 6, Marx's Economic Manuscript of 1864 to 65, translated by Ben Folks, edited, and with an introduction by Fred Mosley. Where we left off yesterday, was somewhere around page 757. And yes, we're going to try and get through the whole damn thing. Not today. It's probably going to take us another weekend. We'll look at this again next weekend. So we were somewhere around 757. Although I don't recognize what we've been yakking about. All right. Yes, because we were going to begin yakking about. Wait a second. Transformation of surplus profit into ground rent. Let's just let's see if we can find the beginning of this section here. So we were talking about the difference or the differential rent versus absolute rent, and more specifically in terms of specific industries. And we left off talking about, for example, the what happens in the difference between land we would consider as forest and land that we would consider as lumber. And secondly, the development of natural science and agronomy leads to changes in the understanding of the fertility of different types of soil and the attitude towards it. This fertility in itself, in fact, alters in line with changes in the means of valorizing it, which are at the society's disposal. Now, we entirely leave out of account here that different plants are subject to wide variations in fertility. Here, we are concerned only with the main sources of food. Fertility would only be constant if the means of valorizing it were immediately and simultaneously available, discovered, or created. In the recent past, for example, light varieties of soil, which were previously considered inferior, have risen to the first rank in France and the eastern counties of England. On the other hand, land which was considered poor not on account of its general chemical composition, but because mechanical and physical obstacles stood in the way of its cultivation, was turned into good land as soon as the means for overcoming these obstacles were discovered. Thirdly, in all countries of old established civilization, old historical and traditional conditions in the form of crown lands, common lands, etc., have withheld great stretches of land from agriculture in a purely arbitrary manner. These lands are gradually coming under cultivation. If one contemplates the history of the Enclosure Acts in England and the history of the common lands which they successively brought under cultivation, a process which is continuing, nothing appears more ridiculous than the fantastic idea that this process was directed by a modern agricultural chemist on the model of Herr von Liebig, and that certain fields were marked off for cultivation on account of their chemical properties and others were excluded. Fourthly, leaving aside, oh, come on. Oh, please. Fourthly, leaving aside the fact that the level of population and capital reached at any given time sets a certain limit to the extension of agriculture in a country, although this limit can in turn be stretched, the decision as to whether more or less new land is taken into cultivation depends on a given situation, not only on accidental factors which have a temporary influence on market prices, such as a series of favorable or unfavorable seasons, but also on the overall condition of the capital market and the business conjuncture in that country. In some periods, the possibility that uncultivated land may yield the farmer an average profit, whether he pays rent or not, will not suffice to draw additional capital towards agriculture. At other times, when capital is abundant, it streams into agriculture even without a rise in market prices, as long as the normal conditions are fulfilled. Better land than that previously cultivated is, in fact, only excluded from competition by the element of location or by previous barriers to the valorization of its peculiar features which have not yet been broken through. Failure of agronomy to break through the barriers, for instance, or by a lack of mechanical means, or else for accidental reasons. We have only to deal, therefore, with kinds of land which are just as good as those last cultivated. Leaving aside the above-mentioned capital and credit conditions, there always exists a distinction between new land and that last cultivated in the shape of the varying cost of plowing up, and it depends on the level of market prices and the situation of the market as a whole, whether this is undertaken or not. Now, once this land actually does come into competition, the market price falls back to it again to its previous level so that the new land will bear the same rent as the old land. Since its fertility is the same, on our assumption, the hypothesis that it will bear no rent is demonstrated by its supporters by assuming that what should actually be proved, namely that the last land did not bear any rent, one could prove in the same way that the last houses to be built yield no rent besides simple interest on the buildings, even if they are rented out. The fact of the matter is that they yield rent even before they bring in house rent, for they often stand empty for a long while. Just as successive capital investments on one piece of land can yield a proportionate surplus product and hence the same rent, so can yield fields of the same quality as those last cultivated yield the same product at the same cost. It would otherwise be incomprehensible how fields of the same quality are ever brought under cultivation successively and not all at once, or indeed why any are at all since the first would draw after it the competition of all the others. The landowner is always ready to draw a rent, i.e., to receive something for nothing. But capital requires certain conditions in order to fulfill his wish. The mutual competition of plots of land depends not on the landowner's intention to have them compete, but rather on the availability of capital to compete on new fields with the old. Since agricultural rent proper is simply a monopoly price, this rent can only be small, just as absolute rent can only be small in normal conditions, whatever the excess value of the product over its production price may be. The essence of absolute rent consists in this: equally large capitals produce different amounts of surplus value in different spheres of production according to their differing average composition, given an equal rate of surplus value or equal exploitation of labor. In industry, these different amounts of surplus value are equalized to give the average profit or are divided uniformly between the individual capitals as aliquot parts of the total social capital. Whenever industry needs land, whether for agriculture or for the extraction of raw materials, landed property blocks this equalization process for the capitals invested on the land and captures a portion of the surplus value which would otherwise which would otherwise go into the equalization process, giving a general rate of profit. Rent then forms a part of the value of commodities, in particular of their surplus value, which simply accrues to the landowners who extract it from the capitalists instead of to the capitalist class who have extracted it from the workers. It is assumed in this connection that agricultural capital sets more labor in motion than an equally large portion of non-agricultural capital. The extent of this gap, or whether it exists at all, depends on the relative development of agriculture and industry. By the nature of the case, this difference must decline with the progress of agriculture unless the ratio in which the variable part of the capital declines vis-a-vis the constant part is still greater in industrial capital than in agricultural. This absolute rent plays a still more important role in extractive industry proper, where one element of constant capital, raw material, completely disappears, and where, with the exception of branches for which the portion consisted of machinery and other fixed capital is very significant, the lowest composition of capital invariably prevails. Precisely here, where rent seems to derive from monopoly price alone, extraordinary favorable market conditions are required for the commodities to be sold at their value or for rent to equal the entire excess of surplus value in a commodity over and above its price of production. This is the case, for example, with rent for fishing grounds, quarries, natural forests, etc. Footnote 39. Wherever rent exists, differential rent always appears and always follows the same laws as it does in agriculture. Footnote 40. Wherever natural forces can be monopolized and give the industrialist who gives use of them a surplus profit, whether it be a waterfall, a productive mine, fishing grounds, or a well-situated building site, the person indicated as the owner of these natural objects, by virtue of his title to a portion of the earth, seizes the surplus profit from the capital in question in the form of rent. As far as land for building is concerned, Adam Smith has discussed how the basis of its rent, as with all non-agricultural land, is governed by agricultural rent proper, footnote 41, with the possible exception of the rent paid for mines. In view of the evident exploitation of increases in population and production on the part of the lazy parasites who own the land, damn it. Darn those lazy parasites. Ah. Sorry. There's something wrong with the scrolling here. Got to get back to those lazy parasites. Wherever rent exists, differential rent always appears and always follows the same laws as it does in agriculture. Footnote 40. Wherever natural forces can be monopolized and give the industrialist who makes use of them a surplus profit, whether it be a waterfall, a productive mine, fishing grounds, or a well-situated building site, the person indicated as the owner of these natural objects, by virtue of his title to a portion of the earth, seizes this surplus profit from the capital in question in the form of rent. As far as land for building is concerned, Adam Smith has discussed how the basis of its rent, as with all non-agricultural land, is governed by agricultural rent proper. Footnote 41, with the possible exception of the rent paid for mines, in view of the evident exploitation of increases in population and production on the part of the lazy parasites who own the land, this non-agricultural rent is characterized first by the preponderant influence that location exerts here on the differential rent. Differential rent is very important, for example, in the case of vineyards. And secondly, by the palpable and complete passivity displayed by the owner, whose activity consists simply in exploiting the progress of social development towards which he does not contribute, and in which he risks nothing, unlike the industrial capitalist. And finally, by the prevalence of a monopoly price in many cases, and particularly the most shameless exploitation of poverty. For poverty is a more fruitful source for house rent than the mines of Potosi were for their owners. Footnote 42. The tremendous power this gives landed property when it's combined together with industrial capital in the same hands enables capital practically to exclude workers engaged in a struggle over wages from the very earth itself as their dwelling place. Here, one section of society demands a tribute from the other for the right to inhabit the earth, just as in landed property in general, the proprietors demand the right to exploit the earth's surface, its bowels and air above, and thereby the maintenance and development of life. See South Africa. The rise in population and the subsequent increase in the need for housing is not the only factor that must necessarily increase the rent on buildings. So too does the development of fixed capital, which is either incorporated into the earth or strikes roots in it, like all industrial buildings, railways, factories, storehouses, docks, etc., which rest on it. It is impossible, even with Carey's determination, to confuse house rent, inasmuch as this is interest on the capital invested in the house, with rent of land pure and simple, particularly when, as in England, the landowner and the speculative builder are completely different people. Two elements come into consideration here. On the one hand, the exploitation of the earth for the purpose of reproduction or extraction. On the other, the space that is required as an element for any production and any human activity. On both counts, landed property demands its tribute. The demand for building land raises the value of land as space and foundation, while at the same time, there is a growing demand for those elements of the earth's physical constitution that serve as building material. For the same reasons, in cities that are experiencing rapid growth, particularly where building is carried on with industrial methods, as in London, it is the ground rent and not the house or the building that forms the real object of speculation. This passage we quote is also interesting because it shows how building has turned into a capitalist trade. Footnote 45. Report on the Bank Acts, 1857, examination of Mr. Edward Capps, builder. He says here, quote, "You must build houses now ready for the market, the same as a bootmaker must make boots, or a stocking manufacturer must make stockings, or any other article. People do not now, generally speaking, order houses to be built as much as they did in those days, the days of his childhood. But If they want houses, they go round and select those which are most suitable for them. Therefore, builders find it just as necessary in the present day to have their commodities ready for the market as any other persons carrying on any other branch of business. It was not so much so formerly. With regard to speculative building, the change has been more of this nature. Formerly, 40 years ago, what houses were built upon speculation were built out of the savings and profits of builders upon their ordinary jobbing business, namely the business that they did to order, and it answered very well at that day. Builders conducted their transactions with very, very great moderation and prudence. They had always had 3 or 4 houses upon the stocks just to keep their men in constant employment, their main reliance being on their ordinary business. But now the business of building is quite altered in that respect. A man can do no good by doing business in that way. He must go and take a large plot of ground, and he must perhaps engage to lay out 20 or 50 times the amount of his own capital upon it. And if he can get through his undertaking before any crash comes, if he can run up a lot of structures, and many of them are very flimsy, I am sorry to say, at the present day, subdivisions, he may make a good slice of money. But he is liable to be pulled up very suddenly by a failure in the finances from the uncertainty of our present monetary system, 2008. Then at present, the general practice is to build upon a large scale, relying upon a demand for houses when they have been built. Yes, and raising money upon mortgage as the buildings proceed. Almost the whole of Belgravia, and Tyburnia, and the countless thousands of villas around London are built upon that principle. There is no risk at all involved here for the landowning gentleman. Either they sell the ground as freehold and anticipate the rent by including it in the price, or they have the building itself as security. 5417, then in general, the materials are paid for, but the money is borrowed. The money is borrowed. The man must have some capital to begin with. I might take a piece of ground requiring a capital of £50,000. I would commence a speculation of that kind, probably with not more than £1,000 or £1,500, just enough to start with. 5435. I think a man who wishes to rise in the world can hardly expect to rise by following out a fair trade, what is called a jobbing trade. He will not make sufficient profit out of it. It is necessary for him to add speculative building to it, and that must be done not on a small scale. It must be done on a large scale. For the builder makes very little profit out of the buildings themselves. He makes the principal part of the profit out of the improved ground rents. Perhaps he takes a piece of ground and agrees to give £300 a year for it by laying it out with care and putting certain descriptions of buildings upon it, and he may succeed in making £400 or £450 a year out of it, and his profit would be the increased ground rent of the £100 or £150 a year rather than the profit of the buildings which he puts upon the ground. That, in many instances, he scarcely looks at all. The actual rent of mines is determined exactly as is agricultural rent. There are some mines of which the produce is barely sufficient to pay the labor and replace, together with its ordinary profits, the stocks employed in them. They afford profit to the undertaker of the work, but no rent to the landlord. They can be wrought advantageously by nobody but the landlord, who, being himself the undertaker of the work, gets the ordinary profit of the capital which he employs in it. Many coal mines in Scotland are wrought in this manner, and can be wrought in no other. The landlord will allow anybody else to work them without paying some rent, and nobody can afford to pay any. It's Adam Smith, footnote 46. It is necessary to distinguish whether the rent flows from a monopoly price, because a monopoly price for the products or for the land itself exists independently of it, or the products are sold at a monopoly price because of the existence of a rent. By monopoly price here, we mean any price determined simply by the desire and ability of the buyer to pay, independently of the price of the product as determined by general price of production and value. A vineyard, for example, bears a monopoly price if it produces wine which is of quite exceptional quality, but can be produced only in relatively small quantities. By virtue of this monopoly price, the wine grower, whose excess over the value of his products is determined purely and simply by the wealth and the preference of fashionable wine drinkers, can realize a substantial surplus profit. This surplus profit, which in this case flows from a monopoly price, is transformed into rent and accrues in this form to the landowner by virtue of his title to the portion of the earth endowed with these special properties. Here, therefore, the monopoly price creates the rent. Conversely, the rent would create the monopoly price if corn were sold not only above its price of production, but also above its value, as a result of the barrier that landed property opposes to the rent-free investment of capital on uncultivated land. The fact that it is only the title a number of people have to property in the earth that enables them to appropriate a part of society's surplus labor as tribute, and in an ever-growing measure as production develops, is concealed by the circumstance that the capitalized rent, i.e. precisely this capitalized tribute, appears as the price of land, which can be bought and sold just like any other item of trade. For the buyer, therefore, his claim to rent does not appear as something obtained for nothing, without the labor, risk, or the entrepreneurial spirit of capital, but rather as the return for his equivalent. Rent seems to him, as we have already noted, simply as interest on the capital with which he has purchased the land, and with it the claim to rent. In exactly the same way it appears to the slave owner who has bought a black slave. Damn it. That his property, it appears to the slave owner who has bought a black slave that his property in the slave is created not by the institution of slavery as such, but rather by the purchase and sale of this commodity. But the purchase does not produce the title. It simply transfers it. The title must be there before it can be bought, and neither one sale nor a series of sales, their constant repetition, can create this title. It was entirely created by the relations of production. Once these have reached the point where they have to be sloughed off, the material source, the economically and historically justified source of the title that arises from the process of the social production of life, ceases to exist, and with it, all transactions based upon it. From the standpoint of a higher socioeconomic formation, the private property of particular individuals in the earth will appear just as absurd as the private property of one man in another man. Even an entire society, a nation, are all simultaneously existing societies taken together are not the owners of the earth. They are simply its occupiers, its beneficiaries, and they have to bequeath it in an improved state to the succeeding generations as boni patres familias, good heads of the household. It has been seen, and here we disregard all fluctuations due to competition, all speculation in land, and even small-scale property, where the earth forms the main instrument of the producers and must therefore be bought by whatever the price, that, number one, Roman numeral 1, the price of land may rise without an increase in rent, namely merely through a fall in the rate of interest, which has the effect that rent is sold at a higher price, and so capitalized rent, the price of land increases. Number 2, subsection 2, because of a growth in the interest of the capital incorporated into the land. Roman numeral, damn it. Roman numeral 2, the price of land may rise because the rent increases. The rent may increase because the price of the product of the land rises, in which the rate of the differential rate always rises, whether the rent on the worst cultivated land is high, low, or non-existent. By the rate of differential rent, we mean the ratio between the part of surplus value that is transformed into rent and the capital advanced to produce the agricultural product. Now, this is different from the ratio between the surplus product and the total product. For the total product, does not include the part of the constant capital advance which has not been consumed in the product but continues to exist alongside it. Now, it is implied in this, however, that on those types of land that bear a differential rent, a growing portion of the product is transformed into excess surplus product. We shall examine this point more closely in the section on differential rent. On the worst land, it is the rise in the price of the product of the land that creates rent for the first time, and hence creates the price of the land. But rent can also grow without any rise in the price of the agricultural product. This can remain constant or even decline. If it remains constant, this is only possible leaving aside monopoly prices for one of two reasons. Either one, because new lands of better quality are cultivated along with equally large capital investments on the older lands, which, however, are sufficient only to meet the increased demand, so that governing market price remains unchanged. In this case, the price of the older lands does not increase, but the price of land newly taken up rises above that of the older land. Or two, because with the relative yield remaining the same and the market price too, amount of capital exploiting the land increases. Thus, even if the rent remains the same in proportion to the capital advanced, it might double in amount, say, because the capital itself has doubled. Now, since there's no fall in the price, the second capital investment yields a surplus profit just as much as the first, which is similarly transformed into rent once the term of the tenancy just expires. The amount of rent rises here because the amount of rent-producing capital rises. The contention that different successive capital investments on the same stretch of land can produce a rent only insofar as their yield is uneven, and therefore a differential rent arises, amounts to saying that if two capitals of 1,000 pounds each are invested on two equally productive fields, only one of them can yield rent, even when these two fields belong to the better class of land, which does yield a differential rent. The sum of rental income, the total ground rent of a country, therefore grows with the amount of capital invested with the extension of cultivation. In short, without necessitating a rise in the price of the individual unit of land or in the rate or even the mass of rent. This can even be combined with a fall in the rent on individual holdings. To deny this would be to maintain that capital investments made successively on two different pieces of land alongside one another in the same location would obey two different laws, although we can derive differential rent from an identical law in both cases, namely from differences in the productivity of capital investment, both on the same field and on different fields. The only modification here which is overlooked is that when successive capital investments are applied to land in different locations, they come up against the barrier of landed property, which is not the case with successive capital investments on the same land. This is the reasons for the check which these different forms of investment exert on each other. There is no difference in the capital involved here. If the composition of capital remains the same, and similarly the rate of surplus value, the rate of profit remains unaltered, so that with twice the capital, there's twice the amount of profit. The rate of rent also remains the same under these conditions. If a capital of 1,000 pounds yields a rent of X, then under the conditions assumed here, one of 2,000 yields a rent of 2X. And 2X, therefore 2,000 equals X, and therefore as X is assumed to be 1,000. But in relation to where X equals 1,000, 2X is 2,000 equals X, whereas X is 1,000. But in relation to the area of land, which remains unchanged, since by our assumption, double the amount of capital is at work on the same field, the result of the rise in the mass of rent is a rise in its rate as well. The same acre which has brought in a rent of 50 now brings in a rent of 100, say. The total rate of rent has thus doubled. The proportion of one part of the surplus value, the money rent, or money, is the independent expression of value to the land. As it stands, seems absurd and irrational, for it is incommensurable qualities that are measured against each other here. A particular use value on the one hand, a piece of land of so-and-so many square feet, and exchange value, in particular surplus value on the other. All this means, in actual fact, is that under the given conditions, the ownership of these square feet of land enables the landowner to seize a certain amount of unpaid labor which capital has realized by rooting in the soil like a pig in potatoes. Prima facie, however, the expression is as if one were to speak of a ratio of a 5-pound note to the diameter of the earth or some other heavenly body. But these irrational forms in which certain economic relationships appear and are grasped in practice are of no concern to the practical bearers of those relationships in their everyday dealings, since they are accustomed to operating within these forms. They do not think there's anything peculiar about them. It's like renting air rights. A complete contradiction holds nothing at all mysterious for them. In forms of appearance that are estranged from their interconnection and taken in isolation are absurd. They feel as much as home as they fish in water. What Hegel says about certain mathematical formula applies here too. What ordinary human understanding finds irrational is in fact rational, and what it finds rational is irrational. Footnotes 48, 49. Since vulgar economics actually does nothing more than interpret, systematize, and turn into apologetics the notion of agents trapped within bourgeois relations of production, it should not surprise us that precisely in the estranged form of appearance of economic relations that involves these prima facie absurd and complete contradictions, and all science would be superfluous if the form of appearance of things directly coincided with their essence. Precisely here, vulgar economics feels completely at home, these relationships appearing all the more self-evident to it the more their interconnections remain hidden, and the more they are comprehensive to the ordinary mind. Thus, it does not have the slightest suspicion that the trinity from which it proceeds, that is, land as to rent, capital is to interest, labor is to wages, or price of labor, consists of the conflation of three things, which is prima facie impossible to perform. First, we have the use value of land, which has no value, and the exchange value, rent. Here, then, a social relation, conceived as a thing, is placed in a proportionate relationship with nature. What we have here are two incommensurable magnitudes. Then capital dash interest. If capital is conceived as a certain sum of value with its independent expression in money, it is prima facie nonsense that a value should have more value than its worth. This form, capital dash interest, is precisely the form in which any mediation disappears, and capital is reduced to its most general formula. But for this reason, also, it is a formula that is absurd and inexplicable. This is precisely the reason why the vulgar economist prefers the formula capital dash interest with its occult quality of a value that is unequal to itself to the formula capital dash profit. As here we already get somewhat closer to the actual capital relation. Then again, disturbed by the feeling that 4 is not 5, and hence 100 shillings cannot possibly be 10 shillings, he flees from capitalist value to the material substance of capital, to its use value as one of labor's conditions of production, i.e. machinery, raw material, etc. It is then possible, instead of the incomprehensible first relationship in which 4 equals 5, to construct this time a completely incommensurable relationship between a use value, a thing, on the one side of the equation, and a specific social relation of production surplus value on the other, as in the case of landed property. As soon as this incommensurability is attained, everything becomes clear to the vulgar economist, and he feels no need for further reflection. For he has reached exactly what is rational to the bourgeois mind. Finally, labor dash wages. The price of labor is an expression which, as shown earlier, footnote 50, absolutely contradicts the concept of value and equally therefore that of price, this being in general only a specific expression of value, so that price of labor is as irrational as a yellow logarithm. The vulgar economist, though, is exceedingly satisfied here, since he's now reached the profound insight of the bourgeois that he pays money for labor, and the very contradiction between this formula and the concept of value relieves him from the obligation of understanding the latter. And I'll stop here because I'd like to show a film at top of the hour, and I hope folks will be amused by that. Let me stop the live stream